Getting arrested for selling watermelons was bad enough. But when a cop smashed my goods, shoved a melon on my head, and laughed, that's when the real show started. You won't believe how this circus ended. All right, let me set the stage. My name's Jerome Carter, 40 years old, ex-police major. Yeah, I spent 20 years in the force, worked my ass off climbing the ranks, and now I'm selling watermelons off a truck at a street corner. Sounds like the punchline to a bad joke, right? But honestly, I liked it. No stress, no uniform, and best of all, no self-important jerks in uniforms trying to flex their power. Or, so I thought. The day started out perfectly normal. The sun was blazing. People were walking by, stopping to buy some of the juiciest, most picture-perfect watermelons you've ever seen. I mean, these things could have been on magazine covers. Business was good, spirits were high, and for once, I caught myself thinking, damn, life's not so bad. Naturally, that's when the universe decided to slap me in the face. Enter Officer Blake. Picture a 30-something white dude, straight out of a cop recruitment poster. Square jaw, immaculate uniform, and an attitude that screamed, "I'm better than you." This guy strutted up to me like he owned the whole block. "Hey you, get this junk out of here. You can't sell stuff here," he barked like I was some kid caught stealing candy. I looked at him, staying as calm as I could. "Officer, I've got a permit. Want to see it?" I pulled out my paperwork, unfolded it right in front of his face. Did he even glance at it? Of course not. Instead, he smirked and leaned in closer, like he was sniffing around for a reason to pick a fight. I said, "Pack it up. Or do I need to explain it in a way you'll understand?" His tone was dripping with condescension, and his fists were clenched, like he was ready to swing. At that point, I realized this wasn't about the watermelons. This guy didn't care about rules or permits. He wanted a scene, but I wasn't about to give it to him. I'd dealt with punks like him before, both on and off the job, so I decided to keep it cool. "Look, officer," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I'm legally allowed to be here. If you've got a problem, maybe call someone who knows how to read." Okay, maybe the sarcasm wasn't my best move, but come on, he was asking for it. His face turned as red as one of my watermelons. Without saying a word, he grabbed one of the biggest melons from my truck, lifted it high over his head, and slammed it onto the pavement. The thing exploded like a grenade. Juice and chunks flew everywhere. "That's what I think of your permit," he said with a smug grin. I couldn't help myself. "Are you serious? What are you, 12? Did mommy not buy you the toy you wanted for Christmas?" The small crowd that had gathered started murmuring. Phones came out. People were filming. Because in this day and age, why step in and help when you can rack up views online? But Officer Blake wasn't done. Oh no, he was just getting started. "Hands behind your back," he ordered, pulling out a pair of shiny handcuffs like he'd been waiting all day to use them. I laughed in disbelief. "You're arresting me for selling watermelons?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm, twisted it behind my back, and shoved me against my truck. People in the crowd started yelling, "Leave him alone, and this is messed up." But Blake? He was loving it. You could see it in the way he held himself, like he was some kind of hero. And then he pulled the move that crossed every line. He picked up one of the watermelon halves from the ground, you know, the ones he'd smashed, and plopped it right on my head. Juice started dripping down my face, seeds stuck to my skin, and the crowd let out a collective gasp. "Now you look like a real watermelon seller," Blake sneered, clearly thinking he'd just delivered the joke of the century. I stood there, sticky and humiliated, with watermelon juice soaking into my shirt while the crowd erupted. Some people were laughing nervously. Others were yelling at Blake. A lady in the front screamed, "You're disgusting!" But he just stood there, proud as a peacock. And me? I felt something boiling up inside me. It wasn't just anger. It was that deep, soul-crushing rage that comes when someone strips you of your dignity in front of everyone. But I didn't let it show. Not yet. I'd seen guys like Blake before, power-hungry, arrogant, and blind to the fact that one wrong move could bring their whole world crashing down. So yeah, that's how my day went from selling fruit to getting arrested with half a watermelon on my head. And trust me, this story's just getting started. They shoved me into the back of the patrol car like I was some kind of hardened criminal. The seats were sticky. The smell was a mix of sweat and fast food. And I couldn't help but think, man, I used to ride in the front of these things. Officer Blake strutted around like he'd just caught a bank robber, while people outside filmed everything. As we drove, Blake couldn't keep his mouth shut. "You think selling watermelons makes you untouchable?" he sneered, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "You're just another punk trying to dodge the rules." I stayed quiet. Let him dig his own grave. But inside? Oh, I was fuming. Not because he arrested me. No, I've been through worse. It was the damn watermelon on my head. That's what got me. The man turned me into a walking meme, and he was loving every second of it. We pulled up to the station and Blake hauled me out like he was showing off a trophy. "Hey guys," he announced to the officers lounging near the entrance. "Caught this one selling illegal watermelons." The room erupted in laughter. One guy shouted, "What's next? A lemonade cartel?" Another chimed in, "Watch out, he might pull a cucumber on you." Oh, hilarious. Real comedians. Meanwhile, I stood there, sticky with watermelon juice, feeling like the punchline to a bad joke. Blake shoved me into a holding cell and slammed the door shut. "Sit tight, Watermelon King," he said, smirking. "You'll be here a while." The cell was cold and smelled like bleach. I sat on the bench, staring at the wall, trying to calm the storm inside me. But then a younger officer, maybe in his late 20s, walked by. He paused, looked me up and down, and said quietly, "You don't belong here." I raised an eyebrow. "Tell that to your buddy out there." The guy glanced around, then leaned in. "That's Blake for you. Always looking for someone to humiliate. He's got a record for this kind of crap, but no one ever calls him out." "Well," I said, leaning back, "looks like that's about to change." The officer gave me a knowing nod and walked off. A few minutes later, another officer, older, grizzled, the kind who'd seen it all, came by. His eyes narrowed when he saw me. "Wait a second," he muttered, stepping closer. "You're Jerome Carter?" I nodded. His face went pale. "Jesus Christ. You're the guy who used to run the precinct upstate, aren't you?" "That's me," I said, not bothering to hide my satisfaction. He turned and stormed out of the room. From where I sat, I could hear the yelling start almost immediately. Blake's name came up, a lot, and from the tone of it, the guy was about to have a very bad day. For the first time since this whole mess started, I smiled. The next morning, I was still in the cell, sipping on some stale coffee that tasted like regret, when things started to get interesting. I heard footsteps, fast, purposeful, and then Captain Bryce himself walked into the holding area. Now, Bryce wasn't the type to mess around. He was the all-business, no-bull kind of guy. And judging by the look on his face, someone had just poured gasoline on his day and lit a match. He stopped dead when he saw me. His eyes widened like he'd seen a ghost. "Carter? Jerome Carter?" His voice was sharp, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Morning, Captain," I said, leaning back on the bench like I had all the time in the world. "Nice to see you again." Bryce's face went from shock to something I can only describe as pure panic. He turned to the officer at the desk. "Get this man out of that cell, now." The young officer scrambled for the keys, and within seconds, I was free. Bryce pulled me aside, lowering his voice like he didn't want anyone else hearing. "Why the hell are you in here? What happened?" "Oh, you know," I said, brushing imaginary lint off my shirt. "Just selling watermelons, minding my business when your boy Blake decided to play sheriff." Bryce's jaw tightened. "Blake did this?" He ran a hand over his face, muttering something that sounded a lot like, "God damn it." Before I could say more, Blake strolled into the room, as cocky as ever. "What's going on here?" he asked, clearly annoyed that someone was messing with his moment of glory. Bryce spun around, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Blake, my office, now." Blake blinked, confused. "What? Why?" "Because I said so," Bryce snapped. His tone left no room for argument. Blake shot me a glare, but he followed orders, disappearing into the captain's office. A few seconds later, the shouting began. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. "Abuse of power, public embarrassment, and in my personal favorite, you put a watermelon on a former police major's head? Are you insane?" Meanwhile, out in the bullpen, the officers who'd been laughing yesterday were suddenly very quiet. Some were sneaking glances at me, probably wondering how they'd missed the part where I wasn't just some random guy with a truck. One of them, the younger officer who'd whispered to me earlier, gave me a subtle thumbs up. At least someone had a brain. After what felt like an eternity, the door to Bryce's office flew open. Blake stormed out, his face red as a ripe tomato. He didn't even look at me as he marched out of the precinct. Bryce followed, rubbing his temples like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. "Carter," he said, motioning for me to come over. "I'll personally make sure this gets handled. Blake's on suspension effective immediately. An internal review is already underway. I'm sorry this happened." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Appreciate it, Captain. But I'm not done with this," Bryce sighed. "I figured you'd say that." As I walked out of the station, the reporters and protesters outside swarmed me like bees to honey. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in my face, and questions came flying from every direction. "Mr. Carter, do you plan to press charges? How do you feel about the way the police handled this? What message do you have for Officer Blake?" I paused, letting the noise die down. Then I smiled. a small, deliberate smile, and said, "Stay tuned." The court date came faster than I expected. The courtroom was packed, with reporters crammed into every available space. Blake sat at the defense table, looking less like the cocky cop I'd met, and more like a guy who just realized his bluff got called. His lawyer tried to spin it, of course. "It was a misunderstanding," he argued. "A lapse in judgment." "Yeah, right. Tell that to the watermelon seeds I'm still finding in my truck." When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. "I spent 20 years in law enforcement," I said, locking eyes with the judge. "I know what it means to wear that badge. It's not a license to humiliate or demean, it's a responsibility. What Officer Blake did wasn't just unprofessional, it was a disgrace." Blake squirmed in his seat, and I swear I saw a few of the jurors nodding along. The video evidence was the nail in the coffin. The footage of Blake smashing my watermelon and shoving the half onto my head played on a giant screen for everyone to see. The courtroom was dead silent, except for the occasional gasp. By the time it was over, Blake's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The verdict? Guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. Blake was officially fired, and I walked out of that courtroom with not just an apology, but a hefty settlement check in my pocket. So what did I do with the money? Opened a foundation to help small business owners fight back against this kind of crap. I even renamed my watermelon stand. Now it's called Major Melons, and trust me, business has never been better. As for Blake, last I heard he was working security at a shopping mall. Guess he finally found a job where he can't put watermelons on people's heads. And me? I'm still out there, selling melons and living my life. But if you think I'm just another guy with a truck, think again. Because if there's one thing this whole mess taught me, it's this. Never underestimate a man who's got nothing left to lose, especially if he knows the system better than you do.